Hi, my name is Daniel, I really love movies, and today I'm going to rank the entire Saw franchise, from the worst to the best. So, I have a very interesting history with this franchise. For one, growing up in the mid-2000s, it was very much the horror franchise that defined my generation, alongside the also ongoing horror remake trend. Even then, it took me quite a long time to come around to these. In fact, I didn't watch them all the way through at least, until this time last year. Of course, that was when Saw X came out. As a kid, we had the DVDs in our house, and the covers alone would scare me. They were one of those. I remember, just out of some twisted curiosity, always putting them in the DVD player and always getting a kick out of, but never getting past, the menus. Might sound weird, but it was always about this rush that I know now was probably that love of horror crawling out of me. Anyway, I didn't watch the first one until I was about 15, and then watched 2 and 3 afterwards before I decided to just stay in this bubble. But eventually, of course, I came out of it, and here we are. This is just my opinion. I'd love for you to comment yours, but without further ado, here's my ranking. In last place is going to be Spiral from the Book of Saw. I actually remember being inside the theater at the mall, about to buy a ticket when, for some reason, I rightfully changed my mind. This was yet another, yes, I already said another, failed attempt at reinventing this franchise for the modern era. The commentary on police corruption was actually a really great idea, but the execution just falls extremely flat. Even though it takes place in the same universe as all the others, it just feels completely far removed from them. It's in a way that it doesn't even feel like... Really? It's in a way that it doesn't even feel like fanfiction. In fact, we even have some bigger names in the cast this time, like Samuel L. Jackson and Chris Rock. That still doesn't do enough. Especially Chris Rock, who basically manifested this movie for himself, but still had me thinking of this. Because yeah, they don't find a good balance with the more comedic tone this one tries and fails to go for. The deaths, as well as the traps, are, for a Saw movie, very tame, and of course, the plot twist is very obvious. All of which makes this one, honestly, very boring. And don't even get me started on that voice.
Live or die. Make your choice.
You're joking.
I get that, much like everything else, it was trying to go for something different, but it just didn't work for me. In 9th place is going to be Jigsaw from 2017. Only somewhat higher than Spiral because it does feel more in line with the franchise, but it still doesn't quite work as the modern reinvention of it. For one, I'm not the biggest fan of the more polished look this one goes for, because for me and many others, the more grungy look is one of the major key components of a Saw movie. I also don't like that, for a Saw movie, they seem to use a lot of CGI. And this one has to have the most frustrating set of characters out of all the group games. They made the dumbest decisions and couldn't seem to work together for the literal lives of most of them. As far as the plot twist, I mean, yes, it's a major cheat, but I can't deny that on that first watch, the build-up to it had me very much on my toes. Then again, once all is said and done, this doesn't really end on a good impression. Like I also didn't mention with Spiral to come back for more, and that's especially disappointing if that was to be the plan. In 8th place is going to be Saw 3D, or Saw the Final Chapter. This one, to me anyway, gets almost too much hate, to be honest. There's plenty to dislike about it, sure, but I don't outright hate it and think it's actually pretty fun. Especially because yes, it's in 3D, which is basically the only way I've ever watched this one. Similar to many 3D horror films, specifically franchise ones, this seems to be where most of the effort goes to. But speaking of fun, I'm all for how much more this one leans into this over-the-top campy tone.
You wanna know the best thing that happened to me after having to cut off my own arm? He's handicapped parking at the damn mall!
And I think they went a lot more in with it because at this point, it's pretty obvious they really wanted to be done with the series. A lot of things seemed very phoned in, to be honest. The storyline of someone pretending to be a Jigsaw survivor and actually being put into a game is actually a really good idea, but it just feels the most, like a lot of this movie, out of left field to the main storyline. This is also perhaps the most unfair and nihilistic out of the series, especially towards women. Regardless of all the many faults this one has, it still somehow brings everything together and wraps things up, even if it's not in the best way. In 7th place is gonna be Saw 3. This movie was very frustrating to place, and I wanted to put it higher, I did, but I think I'm gonna have to trust my gut here. I don't want to say I hated this movie, but I think there's a pretty good reason I only ever watched the first 3. This one honestly kind of drags and always kind of drains the momentum when I re-marathon these. Especially when this was supposed to be the final film and it wasn't. It leaves more questions than answers and, again, feels and goes on longer than it should have. Yes, and this also has the most stressful and slow main character, Jeff. I get that he's a grieving father who's just lost a child, but that's the thing. This one is very depressing. I mean, of course this is a horror movie, and especially a Saw movie, but it's a bit heavier here. His wife, Lynn's game too, is one of the first examples of the more torturous ones. And I don't think, considering what they've lost, they deserve to be a part of this. But what I really like, and think will get a whole lot better depending on where they go after Saw X, is Amanda's storyline here. I think Shawnee Smith really brought her most in this one. As far as what else I enjoyed about it, well, after the first 2, I'd say this is where the death started to get a lot more intense. I wouldn't say it has the goriest, but it certainly has some of the more creative ones. In 6th place is going to be Saw 4. The first and a pretty mediocre, but not awful, attempt at a Saw movie, not without Tobin Bell, but without John Kramer. This one has probably one of the most forgettable main characters in Officer Rigg. Nothing against the actor, by any means, but he's kinda hard to follow or even root for when he seems pretty emotionless the whole time, in a way that he feels very thrown in. His game, or test in general, of you can't save everyone, has to be the most far-fetched out of the whole franchise. Again, it's almost as if they were trying a little too hard to keep things going after what, arguably, could have been the perfect ending at Saw 3. At the same time though, and considering what was to come, I can appreciate this as easy filler, with a little more energy to bring it up from Saw 3 for me. I also like how much further this one goes into Jigsaw's backstory, and kicks the soap opera element into full gear. You know, this one's actually grown on me a lot more than I've let on. I didn't mention this, but way before Saw X came out, I actually did watch just this one after what I'll call my sticking to 1 through 3 phase. Obviously, it didn't make that much of an impression then, but I'm glad I gave it another chance, and of course, watch the other ones. More positives? I'd say this might be one of the goriest, or at least nastiest installments. I mean, the opening scene alone, especially on the unrated version, ugh. In 5th place is going to be the original Saw. A classic for sure, but compared to the others, merely a proof of concept, and a pretty solid one at that. Especially if you take a look back at horror history, this was something that was truly different and unique, and it knew it. A unique premise or setup, characters, and most of all, a very new and unique type of horror villain, Jigsaw. The way he slowly developed in the story was very effective in keeping you on your toes. There were twists and turns at every corner, all of which makes this a pretty compelling mystery as well. This is certainly the most psychological out of the series too. You have these two characters, Adam and Dr. Gordon, who are so contrasting not just in who they are, but how they deal with the situation they're put in. Yet, at the same time, they kind of bounce off each other in a way, and on top of everything else, it's really interesting how they end up connecting to each other. All being said, while the first is nowhere near as intense or bloody as the others, what's implied is still just as effective. And being part of a series that, in my opinion, gets better or at least a lot more interesting as it goes on, it both establishes and gets everything that works so well about the franchise right the first time. From the world building, the thought-provoking storytelling, the traps, deaths, and of course, the plot twists. In 4th place is going to be Saw 2. An improvement over the original that's just as good, but better. Right off the bat, It not only gets right into the action, but it's also a lot more bloodier and intense than the first one. I love how it's not just two people, but a whole group of them this time, and more importantly, how they're also different from each other, yet they actually have a thing or two in common. I've mentioned this before, but I'm a huge sucker for stories like that in any genre of fiction in general. And what I love so much about this franchise is that there's a lot of that. This isn't the best example, but one of the more interesting, especially with how, again, they all connect. I also like how this one has a lot more energy and isn't as contained as the first movie. Of course, this leaves plenty of room, no pun intended, for a lot more set pieces and or scenarios. Like, yes, the iconic needle pit scene. Anyway, what I really love about this one is how much deeper we delve into Jigsaw and get to see Tobin Bell really come into this character. He's much more involved, which of course leads to what I think is perhaps the best plot twist of the series. In third place is going to be Saw 6. This is another one that grew on me, and it used to be much lower, to be honest. When I said I didn't watch all these until last year, I meant I sat through and watched them both blindly and pretty back to back. And this is where things started to lose a little steam for me. Even from the opening, things were starting to feel a lot more rinse and repeat, and it kind of just drained my newfound momentum with the series. Which was even more surprising considering how much I, spoiler alert, enjoyed the previous entry. However, upon this rewatch, I find it quite strange how much more I was able to appreciate about this one. For one, this does indeed have the most interesting commentary on the healthcare industry. It gave us not the best, but one of the more compelling characters to put at the center of one of these games, William Easton. His game was one of the most intense, and the choices he had to make were the most thought-provoking. Of course, even giving us the iconic carousel trap. Even before I knew it was iconic, which I guess I should have at least figured, this was the scene that had me the most like, well damn. Other than that, I really love how much more intense things get for Hoffman in this one. I'd say he grew on me too. I really love the energy that Costas Mandylor brings to the character. But most importantly, I love how Jill Tuck, who of course was Jigsaw's wife, gets more involved in this one. Might sound specific, I'm not quite sure if I'm the only one, but she's one of my favorite characters. I feel like, by Saw standards anyway, she was the closest thing we had to a final girl type of character. Speaking of final girls, we got a, also by Saw standards, final boy, the great Roderick Heffley. And Roderick rules. If only things had ended here, which I want to say they honestly more or less could have. But in second place is going to be Saw 5. Having always watched the first 3 and never having the incentive to go past 4, I have to say that this was a really big surprise for me. More importantly, I was very shocked by the Rotten Tomatoes score. But hey, don't always trust Rotten Tomatoes, right? I gotta say that this one's always been this high for me. There's just so much energy, and for a Saw movie, this is the most lighthearted. And I'm not saying I prefer lighthearted movies, especially with horror, but for a franchise like this, it's nice to have a breather. Of course, you can take all of that with a huge grain of salt anyway, because by the end, it sure reminds you it's a Saw movie. I love this one a lot because it has the strongest main character, Peter Strahm. The back and forth he had with Hoffman was some really fun edge-of-your-seat stuff. Regarding the B storyline, this is also, I want to say, the strongest of all the group games. And that's pretty surprising considering how similar the characters of this group are to the ones in Jigsaw. In fact, it basically starts the same, minus the chum bucket helmets of course. While this group is almost as frustrating as them, they at least get to have their coming together moment, which, again, makes this the strongest of the group games and adds to this one's lighthearted feel. All being said, this is certainly that comforting, middle-of-the-road Saw movie. But in first place is going to be Saw X. This is the first one I ever watched in theaters that, even after recency bias, still holds up. It was the one that obviously inspired me to watch all the others and fall in love with this franchise. Because, and most importantly, it's the modern take of this series that's not really a modern take as it takes place between Saws 1 and 2 that finally got it right. And how did they do it? By literally going back to basics and bringing back both Tobin Bell and Shawnee Smith as John Kramer / Jigsaw and Amanda in ways that we've never seen them before that still felt true to their characters. More specifically with John, and what I want to say is his best storyline, or at the very least, where they really put him in the center. Even more, putting him against someone who was essentially his match in the character of Cecilia. In this context, it makes him like this hero of sorts in a way that, compared to other horror icons that have recently been either softened or downplayed, really lands and makes the most sense. Specifically with this particular character, to be honest. And may I just say, it's pretty obvious that Tobin Bell was born for this role. This had to be his best performance. This one, in general, is the best written too. While the others seemed a lot more ongoing with flashbacks and, of course, those funky transitions, this one took way more time to set things up, including, but not limited to, the characters. It was certainly the most suspenseful too, which, all in all, made this a really great theater experience. For a more polished look too, it still somehow managed to convey that grungy look of the earlier Saw movies that, overall, this one feels like a love letter to and more. With Saw 11 set to come out this time next year, that's supposed to be a continuation of this, I truly can't wait to see where things go from here. Until then, this has been Daniel and my current ranking of the Saw movies. Like, comment, subscribe, and most importantly, keep loving movies.